All who hear and see this letter shall clearly know that after this all these three kingdoms, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, with full agreement and consent of the high-born princess, our gracious lady Queen Margaret, and the goodwill and complete consent of all three kingdoms, have chosen and accepted our gracious Lord King Erik as a rightful Lord and King. These excerpts come from the starting paragraph of a charter from 1397 that will begin what in the history books has become known as the Kalmar Union, named after the city where it was signed. It gives off a sense of unity and harmony amongst the Scandinavian kingdoms. However, what we will see in this episode is that the union, contrary to what the charter states, would not last forever, nor would it be particularly harmonious, and the goodwill would be lacking. On paper, quite literally, Eric was crowned king, but as we will see, Queen Margaret was the one who actually held the power. So, this is the story of ambition, unity, and the tensions that would eventually tear it apart. The Kalmar Union. The Kalmar Union was not born in a time of prosperity. It emerged from crisis, an agrarian crisis that reshaped Scandinavia for centuries. At the end of last episode, the Black Death had left behind a much weakened Europe. Abandoned farms and settlements dotted the land. Up here in the Nordics, it was no different. Although the plague had hit different areas differently, about 50% of the total population had been lost. Of the Scandinavian kingdoms, Norway appears to have been hit the hardest. Here, up to 40% of settlements vanished, and as many as 65% of people perished. It would take over 300 years before the population would reach the same numbers it had on its peak in the early 1300s. In contrast, Sweden and Denmark were less affected, while areas like Scania and Finland appear to have been spared more or less completely. Was this collapse just the plague's legacy, or the breaking point of a fragile medieval system? This is still a debate among historians. This decline, commonly known as the Agrarian Crisis, may also have been caused, inadvertently, by the expanding kingdoms of the High Middle Ages. The increasing population of the time and the need for more land meant that farms were built on less and less fertile soil. The medieval farming techniques and social structures could not keep up, leading to famines and decreasing populations. With fewer hands to work the land and marginal soil pushed to its limits, hunger became a recurring shadow over the Nordic kingdoms. At a safe distance from the mainland, the Black Death never reached Iceland. We can still find evidence of desolation and abandoned settlements in the sources, so what could be the cause? One more recent explanation has been a different plague, known as Plagan Mikla, the Big Plague, that reduced the population by 50 to 60% between 1402 and 1404. The Black Death may have been the biggest and baddest of them all, but it was far from the last plague. Different local outbreaks would come and go over the coming centuries. The area of Scandinavian influence that would be most affected by the agrarian crisis was Greenland, with the result that the island would be abandoned by the Scandinavian settlers. The population, which only ever reached about 2,000 people, had all but disappeared by the late 1400s. It is likely that they left rather than died, and the proposed causes have been numerous. Violent confrontations with the Inuits, who had migrated in from what is now northeastern Canada, is one. The reduced demand for walrus ivory, being replaced by elephant ivory is another. There is also the climate. This was the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a period of colder climates that would affect Europe and the Northern Hemisphere into the 1700s. It simply became too cold to survive on European farming methods in Greenland. The Scandinavians would return to the island, but that's a story for another time. Beyond Scandinavia, the world wasn't standing still. One of the rising powers was the Hanseatic League, the Hansa. The Hanseatic League wasn't a kingdom or any kind of political project, at least not at the start. It was instead a loose alliance between several cities, bound by trade and mutual interest. At the center of this alliance was the port city of Lübeck, at the northern coast of modern day Germany. Other Hanse cities include Hamburg, Bremen, Danzig, which is modern day Gdansk, and Riga. The network of trade routes the Hanse built up would come to span as far west as London, north to Bergen, and east throughout the Baltic Sea all the way to Novgorod. In major foreign cities like these, the Hanse set up trading posts, known as kontors, run as corporations with a degree of legal autonomy that set them apart from the cities they were based in. The word kontor comes from Middle Low German, derived from the French compta and Latin computare, meaning to calculate. A fun side note here is that the term survives in the modern Scandinavian languages. In both Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, a kontor is an office. There were also smaller outposts known as faktorien, factories. If we keep to the Nordic perspective here, the most important of these contours was Bryggen, the dock, in Bergen, established around 1350. Locally, it's known as Tyskebryggen, the German dock, just to hammer home the fact that it was a foreign outpost rather than anything controlled by the local Norwegians. From here, the Hanse traded, amongst other things, one of the most important Norwegian exports, stockfish. Stockfish, tørrfisk in Norwegian, is, well, fish, usually cod, that is left out in the cold Nordic air to dry. This acts as a preservation method and can make the fish last for years. Centuries before refrigeration, or even before salting fish became economically feasible, that would happen in the 1600s, this was the best, if not only, way to preserve perishables like fish for any amount of time. An important note on the diet of the era is that unless you're quite literally royalty, or at least nobility, fresh food was extremely hard and rare to come by. Most of your diet as Joe the farmer would consist of bread, cheese, and of course the stockfish. Demand across Europe made the stockfish a cornerstone of Hanseatic wealth. The monopoly was later broken when the English and the Dutch started either fishing the North Sea for themselves or trading the stockfish directly with the locals in the 1400s. This is a period known as the English time in Iceland. Another cornerstone of the league were the guilds. They were associations of craftsmen or merchants who banded together for mutual benefit. At their core, guilds served two main purposes: economic regulation and social security. Economically, guilds controlled quality, prices, and training. If you were a shoemaker, a brewer, or a blacksmith, your guild set the standards for your craft and assured that only trained members could sell their goods. This protected both the reputation of the trade and the income of its members. Guilds also had a strict hierarchy. Apprentices trained under masters, became journeymen, and eventually earned the right to open their own workshops. This system ensured quality and stability in a world where trust was everything. Socially, guilds acted as a safety net. They provided support in times of illness, helped with funeral costs, and even cared for widows and orphans of deceased members. In an era without state welfare, guilds were a lifeline. Merchant guilds were especially powerful. They didn't just regulate trade, they dominated it. The Hanseatic League itself grew out of these merchant guilds, expanding from local associations into an international network that controlled commerce across Northern Europe. The valuable cargo that the Hanseatic merchant ships carried required protection, which meant that some of them were converted for war. The staple of the Hanseatic fleets was the trusty cog, a sturdy single-masted vessel with high sides, ideal for carrying cargo and for defense in naval combat. And yes, we're talking about fleets, plural. As the Hanse wasn't a solid unit, each city had its own fleet, both for trade, war, and the occasional naval blockade. The different cities could unite for a common cause, but it was rare and not a requirement of the League. These fleets gave the Hanse the ability to enforce trade monopolies and wage war, as we will see in their clashes with Denmark and later the Kalmar Union. At the beginning of the episode, we mentioned that Erik was unanimously crowned king of not one, but three kingdoms simultaneously. Your likely question here is, well, how the heck did that happen? And to understand that, we need to go back a few decades before the assembly at Kalmar. During the mid 1300s, King Magnus Eriksson ruled Sweden and Norway, including Iceland and the other North Atlantic islands settled by Scandinavians. Magnus had two sons, Erik and Håkon. Magnus's idea was fairly simple in theory. Håkon would inherit the Norwegian throne, while Erik would be elected king in Sweden. Sadly, such plans very rarely work out. We should probably also pause here just to clarify the throne and succession situation. For most European kingdoms of the time, power was inherited from father to the eldest son. There could be ruling queens as well. In fact, we'll soon meet one of the greatest of them. But they usually just held the formal power, the regency, until their underage sons came of age. Norway and Denmark were both such hereditary kingdoms at the time, while Sweden's regent was elected. Now, we're not talking about a democratic vote near anything we have today. The people, men mostly, who did the electing were the aristocracy, the very top of the aristocracy at that. Alliances between families through blood or marriage and the influence that brought could swing the election to one candidate or the other. The candidates were almost always drawn from royal families, i.e., families with previous kings in their lineage. Having been elected, that doesn't mean that a king is safe. The Swedish aristocracy was far from a passive entity. It was working for its own self-interests, wanting to control Sweden on its own terms, the authority of kings be damned. After a falling out between the aristocracy and King Magnus, the nobles rebelled and elected his son Erik as king in 1356. 3 years later, however, in 1359, Erik was dead at the age of 20. The cause of death was probably the Black Death. Erik's wife Beatrix would also succumb to this a few months later. Erik's death left Sweden in turmoil. Magnus regained the crown, but his authority remained fragile. Håkon, on the other hand, was declared of age in 1355 and became the sovereign ruler of Norway, formally at least. His father still held a significant influence. To the south, Denmark was in resurgence. After a long period of political fractures that should probably be its own episode, Valdemar Atterdag became king of Denmark in 1340 and began to reunite the shattered Danish realm. His suffix Atterdag is generally seen to mean dawn or again day if you go for the more literal translation. This is supposed to refer to the fact that Denmark again saw the light of day after a long night of darkness and turmoil. The Danish realm that Valdemar intended to reunite included the Scanian region, which he took back from Sweden by force in 1360. Denmark was now back in the game. In 1361, Valdemar invaded Gotland and forced Visby to surrender, imposing a heavy ransom and allowing his troops to plunder the city, the infamous sack of Visby. Gotland was formerly Swedish, but Visby's strong ties to the Hanseatic League made this a direct challenge to Lübeck and its allies. War was inevitable. In 1363, another important event happened, namely the marriage between Håkon and Margaret, the daughter of Valdemar Atterdag. This greatly strengthened the ties between the kingdoms of Norway and Denmark, and also the power of the monarchy. The Swedish aristocrats saw what was coming, a more centralized monarchy where they, the nobility, would be left out of the true power. Being a rather independent-minded bunch, they again decided to elect their own king, and the choice fell on Albert of Mecklenburg, Albrecht if you're German, in 1364. King Albert, as we will call him from now on, was the son of Duke Albert of Mecklenburg, and Magnus's sister Euphemia. The family intrigue here is just precious. I'm starting to feel like Charlie Day's character from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia trying to explain all this. Seriously, if you're feeling lost, don't worry, you're not alone. Even the nobles back then were probably just as confused. The war between Valdemar and the Hansa continued until the Treaty of Stralsund in 1370. This was a win for the Hansa, and they were given control of the western Scandinavian coast along the Öresund Strait for the next 15 years. This was a gut punch to Valdemar and Denmark. Control of the Öresund meant controlling the tolls on Baltic trade, a golden ticket for the Hansa. Valdemar died in 1375, and his Danish crown passed to Margaret's and Håkon's 5-year-old son, Olav. In 1380, Olav also inherited the Norwegian crown at the death of Håkon. Margaret would act as regent until Olav came of age, which he barely did. He died in 1387 at the age of 16. Being a now childless widow, Margaret acted with great skill and purpose. Within a year, she was recognized as the sovereign lady and true ruler of Norway and Denmark. This union would last for more than 400 years, and Norway would now take the back seat to the far stronger Denmark. In Sweden, the nobles started to regret their choice of ruler. King Albert brought in German mercenary troops and appointed German nobles to positions of power and as administrators rather than appointing local Swedes, which the Swedish country law specifically stated that it should. I'll give you exactly one guess as to what the Swedish nobles did now. That's correct, rebellion. The nobles allied with Queen Margaret, a rather ironic alliance when you think about it, since these same nobles had fought to keep Sweden independent from foreign influence. They defeated King Albert at the Battle of Falköping in 1389. After the victory, Margaret was now also recognized as the true ruler of Sweden. Due to one woman's guile and political maneuvering, all three crowns now rested on one head. Now you're probably thinking, okay, so Queen Margaret now rules all three kingdoms. Then who's this Erik dude you keep mentioning? Being a childless widow meant that Margaret had no heir to her three kingdoms. Medieval norms also meant that she herself could never be crowned king, only serve as regent for a male heir. The heir would also need to have strong ties to the previous kings. This heir apparent would be the boy Bogislav. His father was Duke Wartislav VII of Pomerania. His mother was Maria, Queen Margaret's sister's daughter. She was also the daughter of Henry, the now Duke of Mecklenburg, older brother of the deposed King Albert. As if this family tree wasn't complicated enough, his bloodline ticked all the boxes: ties to Margaret, ties to the old Swedish royal house, and a princely rank. The name Bogislaw sounds a bit foreign for a Scandinavian king, though, so it was changed to Erik. And here we have our Erik of Pomerania. Changing names to fit local tradition was nothing uncommon. Erik sounded suitably Scandinavian for a king. A side note on his name: it's common in Scandinavian historic writing to label unpopular kings of a more foreign extractions by their origins. So Erik is known as Erik of Pomerania rather than just King Erik. In the same vein, King Albert is known in Sweden as Albrecht of Mecklenburg. It's a subtle way of saying, you're not really one of us. We'll get to why Erik deserved the title in a bit. First, he has to actually become king. Erik was recognized as the inheritor of Norway in 1389. In 1396, he was elected king of Sweden and also Denmark. The Swedish crown did not come free of charge. It had to be bargained for. Without going too far into the details, these issues were solved at the recess of Nyköping. You can think of it as political cleanup, undoing King Albert's mess and making peace with the aristocracy. Estates and privileges granted during King Albert's reign were revoked. The church accepted the agreement in exchange for donations, though its own tax-exempt lands were reduced. The Swedish aristocracy regained privileges that they had before Albert's arrival, and the new nobility created under him lost their special status. Another important decision was that the three kingdoms would come together and agree that wars and feuds for all eternity would be avoided between them. This assembly would happen in July of 1397 at the castle in Kalmar. The Kalmar Union was ready to be formed. So we're finally at the actual formation of the Kalmar Union, some 24 minutes into this video. But what did the union actually mean? What was it? Well, for one, the name is a later construction, simply noting the city and castle where it was formed. It was never ruled from there, nor known by such a name at its time. It was also not one large kingdom. Each of its three constituents would be governed separately, with their own laws and customs, under a single king, in what is known as a personal union. These unions aren't that uncommon in medieval Europe. Another prominent example is the union of Poland and Lithuania, which would have a longer history than the Kalmar Union, but we won't get into that here. Outwardly, on the other hand, the Kalmar Union would present one front, uniting in foreign policy and commerce. At least that was the idea. In practice, things would get complicated. From the Kalmar Assembly, two documents survive. The first is the Coronation Charter, signed on July 13th. This is written on parchment with the wax seals of 67 bishops and lords from all of the three kingdoms. This makes it a legally binding contract by the standards of the age. The charter does what it says on the tin. It formalizes the coronation of Erik of Pomerania as King of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It advocates for hereditary kingship, opposing the traditions of the elective monarchy of Sweden. It also emphasizes the subservience of the aristocracy to the crown, a regime regale. The other document is known as the Union Letter. It is written on paper and never transferred to parchment. It also only has 17 signatories, none of them from Norway. In short, this makes it legally weaker than the Coronation Charter. Like its name suggests, it advocates a more equal union, with the kingdoms retaining their own laws and administration. The letter also contains the Peace for All Eternity and Mutual Defense declarations. On the back of the letter, we have the notation Hur det var talet I Kalmar. It's disputed if this means as it was discussed in Kalmar or how it was agreed in Kalmar, as the phrase can be interpreted as either. These two documents are generally seen not as opposing views on union versus national interests, but instead as unveiling the conflict between the crown on one side and the local aristocracies on the other. The power of the crown came mainly from Denmark, and the nobles of Sweden would, hardly surprising, oppose the union and strive to weaken it. Centuries later, Abraham Lincoln said of the United States, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." No truer words could be said about the Kalmar Union. With Erik crowned king and Margaret being the power behind the throne, it's all sunshine and roses from now on, right? Wrong! At the formation of the Union, Sweden was in a bit of a mess. Stockholm, the richest and most fortified city, was under the control of the Hanseatic League, practically being a German city more than a Swedish one. It was the last remaining stronghold of the ousted King Albert's supporters. Along with that, Sweden's Baltic coast and the Åland Islands were plagued by pirates, the Victual brothers, with their headquarters in Visby. They had been initially hired by the Mecklenburgs as privateers against Margaret's forces, but later turned to outright piracy. In 1394, Albert had been released from captivity under a massive ransom deal, 8,000 kilos of silver. Until that was paid, Stockholm was handed over to the Hansa as collateral. The League fortified and managed Stockholm, sending men-at-arms, crossbowmen, cannons, and provisions to secure the city. But Albert couldn't pay, so in 1398 the Hanse gave up Stockholm to Margaret. To pry the Victual brothers out of Visby and Gotland, Margaret called upon the help of the Teutonic Order. Their Grand Master, Conrad von Jungingen, invaded and successfully conquered the island. The Baltic was calm, for now. Teutonic rule would continue for a decade, and in 1408 Gotland was handed over to Margaret for a large ransom. The castle of Visborg was constructed, just south of Visby, solidifying the crown's control. Bad for Visby's independence, great for the crown, although very expensive. All these endeavors led to what they usually do: raised taxes. And what monarchs tend to not learn not to do is to raise the taxes of their subjects. And rebellion, it was already knocking. In 1412, Queen Margaret passed away, seemingly from a sudden illness on board her ship in Flensburg harbor. The end of a titan in Nordic history. She now lies entombed in Roskilde Cathedral in Denmark. The power, in truth, passed to Erik. Margaret's vision had united Scandinavia under one crown, but without her, that unity was fragile. Erik would spend the rest of his reign working to consolidate more power and control with the monarchy, something not viewed favorably by the aristocracy. In Sweden, the nobleman Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson led a rebellion against him in 1434. You could make a drinking game out of this. Take a shot every time someone in Sweden rebels against the crown. The rebellion started in Bergslagen, a region of Sweden known for bergsmännen, the mountain men, and their mining of iron. Engelbrekt was one of these mountain men and led the rebellion mainly for economic reasons. Bergslagen's iron exports had been harmed by the conflicts with Lübeck and the Hanseatic League. The rebellion spread across most of Sweden, the Danish forces were expelled, and Erik essentially lost control of the kingdom. The Engelbrekt rebellion ended after Engelbrekt was murdered in 1436. But Erik would never get the kingdom back under control. He was deposed as King of Sweden and Denmark in 1439. Norway would follow suit and depose him in 1442. His replacement was Christopher of Bavaria. Of course, Christopher wasn't just another random foreigner, but Erik's nephew. He also has one of those not from around here names, so we'll see how his rule goes. Erik eventually returned to Pomerania and ruled it as Duke until his death in 1459. With both Erik and Margaret being out of the picture, the union would go into decline. Cracks would form, and it would eventually shatter. In the next episode, we will see the union end in blood, a veritable bloodbath, if you will. Thank you for watching.